When you think of legendary Ford big blocks, your mind probably goes straight to the 427 side oiler, the thunderous 428 Cobra Jet, or maybe the mighty 429 Boss. But there's one massive Ford V8 that's been hiding in the shadows of automotive history for over 60 years. Meet the Lincoln 430 MEL, a colossal luxury big block that was bigger, badder, and thirstier than almost anything else on the road in 1958. Today, we're diving deep into Ford's forgotten giant and discovering why this engine deserves way more respect than it gets. It's 1957, and Ford Motor Company has a problem. Lincoln is getting absolutely destroyed in the luxury car market by Cadillac's mammoth 365 cubic inch V8, and something had to be done. Ford's response wasn't subtle. They created the MEL engine family, standing for Mercury, Edsel, and Lincoln, and the crown jewel was the absolutely massive 430 cubic inch version destined for Lincoln. Now, to put this in perspective, the new 430-inch MEL engine for 1958 was also the biggest by far in its time. We're talking about an engine that displaced 7 liters when most competitors were still running around 6.0 to 6.4 liters. This wasn't just big, this was enormous. The 430 MEL made its debut in 1958, and right from the start, it was clear this engine meant business. With 375 HP and a big 4-barrel carb, it could push the 1958 lead sled to 60 in some 8.7 seconds. In an era when most luxury cars took well over 10 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, that was genuinely impressive performance. But here's where things get interesting. The Ford MEL is a big block 90-degree V8 engine family produced in various configurations by the Ford Motor Company between 1958 and 1967 in displacements from 383 to 462 cubic inches. The 430 was just one member of this family, but it was the sweet spot between the smaller Mercury 383 and the absolute monster 462 that would come later. Now, here's where the 430 MEL gets really fascinating from an engineering standpoint. There were no combustion chambers in the cylinder head. Wait, what? That's right, it is a plank head engine, meaning that the head is totally flat and the combustion chamber is actually created by the angle of the block deck and the top of the piston. This was wildly different from pretty much every other V8 being built at the time. Most engines had their combustion chambers machined into the cylinder heads, but Ford's engineers went a completely different route with the MEL. The combustion chamber was formed by the deck angle of the block and the shape of the piston crown. This design had some serious advantages. It allowed for much better flame travel and more efficient combustion, especially important in an engine this large. The bore and stroke numbers tell the story of this engine's character. We're looking at a 4.38-inch bore and a 3.70-inch stroke. This gave the engine a relatively over-square design, which was perfect for high RPM breathing and power production. All were built on the same basic architecture, with 4.90-inch bore spacing, which was massive for the time and allowed for huge intake and exhaust ports. Speaking of ports, the intake and exhaust flow capabilities of these engines were genuinely impressive. The heads featured large, well-designed ports that could move serious air, and when you combine that with the flathead combustion chamber design, you get an engine that could breathe like nothing else in its class. The block itself was a work of art. Thick cast-iron construction with deep skirts and a robust main bearing structure. This wasn't some lightweight economy engine. This was built to last and handle serious power. The crankshaft was forged steel, the connecting rods were heavy-duty pieces, and everything about this engine screamed premium construction. But perhaps the most interesting aspect was the cylinder head design. Because the combustion chamber was in the block rather than the head, Ford could make the heads much simpler to manufacture while still achieving excellent flow characteristics. The valves were arranged in a wedge pattern, and the intake ports were absolutely massive, perfect for feeding this hungry beast. When the 430 MEL first hit the scene in 1958, it was available in multiple power levels, and every single one of them was impressive. The base version made 315 horsepower, which was already more than most engines of the time. But if you wanted more, and let's be honest, who didn't, you could step up to the 375 horsepower version. Compression ratios started at 10.5 to 1, but soon began to decline late in 1959 to 10.0 to 1 at 350 horsepower. The higher horsepower versions of the 430 remained within its first year of production, with horsepower of 365, 375, and of course 400. That's right, there was actually a 400 horsepower version of this engine, making it one of the most powerful engines you could buy in 1958. Now, 400 horsepower might not sound like much by today's standards, but in 1958, that was absolutely earth-shattering. To put this in perspective, the legendary 1957 Chevy 283 fuel-injected engine, considered one of the hot rod heroes of all time, made 283 horsepower. The 430 MEL in top trim was making 40% more power than that. But here's where things get really interesting. This wasn't just about peak horsepower numbers. The 430's long stroke and massive displacement meant it made tremendous torque. We're talking about torque figures in the 400 to 450 pound-feet range, depending on the specific configuration. That's the kind of grunt that could move a 5,000-pound Lincoln with surprising authority. The engine's breathing was helped by some serious carburetor setups. Only 1 year a Holley carburetor was used in 1958, though most years saw Carter AFB 4-barrels. These were big carburetors. We're talking about 650 to 700 CFM units that could feed this beast properly. Performance in the real world was genuinely impressive for the late 1950s. That 8.7-second 0 to 60 time I mentioned earlier was achieved in a car that weighed over 5,000 pounds. For comparison, a 1958 Corvette with the 283 fuel-injected engine could do it in about 7.5 seconds, but it weighed nearly 2,000 pounds less. The big Lincoln was remarkably quick for its size. Quarter-mile times were equally impressive. A well-tuned 430-powered Lincoln could run the quarter in the high 16s to low 17s, which was genuinely fast for a luxury car of that era. The engine had plenty of top-end power too, with many examples capable of cruising comfortably at 90-100 miles per hour all day long. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room: fuel consumption. Its thirst was single-digitally prodigious, to say the least. We're talking about an engine that considered 8 miles per gallon to be good fuel economy. In city driving, owners were lucky to see 6 mpg, and highway driving might bump that up to a whopping 10 mpg on a good day. This fuel consumption wasn't just bad by today's standards. It was pretty terrible even by 1958 standards. But here's the thing. People buying a Lincoln in 1958 with a 430 MEL weren't too concerned about fuel economy. Gas was cheap, these were luxury cars for wealthy buyers, and the performance and prestige were worth the extra cost at the pump. The fuel consumption was a direct result of the engine's design priorities. This was an engine built for power and smoothness, not efficiency. The large displacement, high compression ratios, and massive carburetor all contributed to its thirst. The engine also ran pretty rich from the factory. Ford prioritized smooth operation and reliability over fuel economy. Interestingly, the fuel consumption actually got worse as the years went on. In 1959, the horsepower slowly began to reduce, but the fuel consumption didn't improve proportionally. This was partly due to increasingly strict emissions controls and partly due to the fact that Ford was still learning how to tune these massive engines properly. The reality was that if you owned a 430 MEL Lincoln, you needed to budget for fuel costs. A typical owner might spend $50 to $60 per month on gas in 1958 dollars. That's equivalent to about $500 to $600 per month today. It was expensive, but for the people buying these cars, it was just part of the ownership experience.
So, how did the 430 MEL stack up against its competition? In 1958, the main rivals were Cadillac's 365 cubic inch V8 and Chrysler's 392 Hemi. Each had their own strengths and weaknesses, but the Lincoln held its own quite well. Cadillac's 365 made about 310 horsepower in top trim, respectable, but not as much as the Lincoln's 375 or 400 horsepower versions. The Cadillac was smoother and more refined, and definitely more fuel efficient, but it couldn't match the Lincoln's raw power output. Cadillac's reputation for quality was also better established at this point. Chrysler's 392 Hemi was a different animal entirely. This engine made similar power to the Lincoln, but did it with better efficiency and more advanced engineering. The Hemi head design was superior to the Lincoln's flathead setup in many ways, and the 392 had a reputation for being more reliable. However, it was also significantly more expensive to manufacture and repair. But here's where the 430 MEL really shined. It was the torque king. While the Hemi made its power at higher RPMs and the Cadillac was more of a refined cruiser, the Lincoln made massive torque down low. This made it perfect for moving heavy luxury cars effortlessly, and it gave the Lincoln a unique character that was all its own. In terms of actual performance, road tests from the era showed that the Lincoln could hang with or beat most of its competitors in straight-line acceleration. The combination of high power and tremendous torque made it a formidable performer, especially considering the weight of the cars it was powering. One area where the Lincoln fell short was in longevity and reliability. While the engine itself was robust, the complex carburetor setups and high-performance nature meant more maintenance was required compared to the more conservative Cadillac engines. The Chrysler Hemi was probably the most durable of the three, but it was also the most expensive to maintain. The 430 wasn't alone in the MEL family. It had some interesting siblings that deserve mention. Between 1958 and 1968, the MEL V8 was produced in 4 displacements: 383, 410, 430, and 462 cubic inches. The 383 was the Mercury version, featuring a 3.3-inch stroke, different crank compared to the 430. This smaller displacement version was still a substantial engine by the standards of the time, making around 280 to 300 horsepower depending on the year and application. It was essentially a D-stroked 430, sharing the same basic architecture but with different internal components. The 410 was even more exclusive, 1958 Edsel only, 4.2-inch bore, different pistons. This engine was unique to the ill-fated Edsel brand and represents one of the rarest MEL engines ever produced. With Edsel's quick demise, very few of these engines survived, making them incredibly rare today. At the other end of the spectrum was the mighty 462. Bore and stroke were entirely different at 4.38 and 3.83 inches, and the 462 MEL engine produced 340 horsepower and as much as 485 pound-feet of torque. This was the ultimate MEL engine, an absolute monster that made the 430 look tame by comparison. The 462's torque output was simply staggering for the time. 485 pound-feet was more than most modern engines produce, and in the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was virtually unheard of. This engine was reserved for the largest, most expensive Lincolns and represented the absolute pinnacle of American luxury car performance. What's interesting is how all these engines shared the same basic architecture, shared a bell housing pattern with FE engines and Y blocks between 58 and 60, which meant they could interchange transmissions with Ford's other V8 families during those years. This made the MEL engines surprisingly versatile for hot rodders and racers who discovered their potential. The MEL family also had some interesting technical variations. The best performance heads for the MEL are the 462 heads. Apparently, the older heads with bigger ports do not flow nearly as well.
This means that for maximum performance, enthusiasts today often seek out the later 462-cylinder heads to swap onto their 430 engines. While the 430 MEL was primarily designed as a luxury car engine, it didn't take long for hot rodders and racers to discover its potential. The combination of massive displacement, robust construction, and good power potential made it attractive to those looking for something different from the usual small-block Chevy or Ford FE route. In drag racing circles, the 430 MEL developed a small but devoted following. The engine's massive torque output made it excellent for bracket racing, where consistency was more important than ultimate power. Many racers found they could build a reliable, powerful 430 for less money than a comparable 427 or 428, especially in the early days when these engines were more common in salvage yards. The flathead combustion chamber design actually had some advantages for racing applications. It allowed for better flame travel and more consistent combustion, which translated to more predictable power delivery. This was especially valuable in drag racing, where consistent performance was crucial. Hot rodders appreciated the 430's massive torque output for street applications. In a heavy street rod or muscle car, the 430's low-end grunt made for excellent drivability. The engine didn't need to be revved high to make power. It made its best torque right where you needed it for street driving. One of the challenges for hot rodders was the relative scarcity of performance parts. Unlike the popular Ford FE or Chevy big block engines, the MEL family never developed a huge aftermarket following. This meant that building a high-performance 430 required more creativity and custom work than other engines of the era. However, those who persevered found that the 430 could be built into a serious performer. With the right heads, cam, and carburetor setup, a 430 MEL could easily make 500-plus horsepower, impressive even by today's standards. The robust block construction meant it could handle significant power increases without major internal modifications. The engine's large bore spacing also made it attractive for extreme builds. Those massive bores could accommodate enormous valves, and the strong block could handle significant overboring for even more displacement. Some builders created 450-plus cubic inch versions that made tremendous power. Unfortunately, the 430 MEL's time in the sun was relatively brief. Several factors contributed to its decline and eventual disappearance from the Lincoln lineup. First was the changing automotive landscape of the early 1960s. Fuel economy concerns were beginning to emerge, and the 430's single-digit gas mileage was becoming harder to justify, even in the luxury segment. Insurance companies were also starting to take notice of high-performance engines, and the 430's power output was beginning to attract unwanted attention from that sector. More significantly, Ford was consolidating its engine programs. The MEL family was expensive to produce. It shared no components with Ford's other V8 engines, which meant separate tooling, separate parts inventory, and higher manufacturing costs. From a business standpoint, it made more sense to develop engines that could be used across multiple product lines. In 1959, the horsepower slowly began to reduce, and this trend continued through the early 1960s. The high-performance versions that made 375 and 400 horsepower were discontinued first, followed by progressive detuning of the remaining versions. This reduced the engine's appeal and made it less competitive with other manufacturers' offerings. By 1966, the writing was on the wall. Lincoln switched to Ford's new 460 Big Block, part of the 385 series engine family that would eventually replace both the MEL and FE engines. The 460 offered similar power and torque to the MEL engines, but with better fuel economy and lower manufacturing costs. The final MEL engines were produced in 1968, ending a 10-year run that had started with such promise. The transition to the 460 was relatively smooth for Lincoln customers. The new engine offered similar performance characteristics, but with better efficiency and reliability. What's tragic is how quickly the MEL engines were forgotten. Unlike the Ford FE engines, which remained popular with hot rodders and collectors, or the Chevy Big Blocks that achieved legendary status, the MEL engines faded into obscurity. Part of this was due to their limited production numbers and applications. They were never used in popular performance cars like Mustangs or Camaros.
Today, the 430 MEL occupies a strange position in the collector car world. On one hand, these engines are incredibly rare and represent a fascinating chapter in American automotive history. On the other hand, they're still relatively unknown and underappreciated compared to their more famous contemporaries. For collectors of 1958 to 1960 Lincolns, finding a car with an original 430 MEL is increasingly difficult. Many of these engines were swapped out over the years for more common Ford FE engines, and others were simply scrapped when their host vehicles reached the end of their useful life. A genuine, numbers-matching Lincoln with its original 430 is becoming quite valuable. Complete engines are still available from specialty rebuilders, but they command premium prices due to their rarity and the specialized knowledge required to rebuild them properly. A quality rebuild of a 430 MEL can easily cost $15,000 to $20,000 or more, making them expensive to restore correctly. The engines have also found new life in marine applications. Many of the surviving 430 and 462 MEL engines ended up powering boats, where their massive torque output and robust construction made them excellent marine engines. Some of the best preserved examples of these engines are actually found in boats rather than cars. For hot rodders today, the 430 MEL represents an interesting alternative to more common engine swaps. While parts are more expensive and harder to find, the uniqueness factor and impressive power potential make them attractive to those looking for something different. The flathead combustion chamber design and massive displacement give these engines a character that's unlike anything else from the era. Modern engine management systems have also opened up new possibilities for MEL engines. Electronic fuel injection can solve many of the fuel economy and drivability issues that plagued these engines when new, while modern ignition systems can extract even more power from their massive displacement. Values for these engines continue to climb as collectors recognize their historical significance. A good running 430 MEL can command $5,000 to $8,000, while a properly rebuilt example might bring $12,000 to $15,000 or more. Complete, running cars with original engines are becoming genuinely valuable collector items. So, why should we care about the Lincoln 430 MEL today? What makes this forgotten engine worth remembering and celebrating? First, it represents a pivotal moment in American automotive history. The late 1950s were the absolute peak of the horsepower race, and the 430 MEL was right at the forefront of that movement. It showed what American engineers could accomplish when given unlimited budgets and ambitious goals. The technical innovations in the MEL engine were genuinely significant. The flathead combustion chamber design was unique and effective, and the overall engineering of these engines was top-notch. They represented some of the best work that Ford's engineers were capable of during this golden age of American automotive engineering. The 430 MEL also represents the last gasp of the bigger is better philosophy that dominated American car design in the 1950s. These engines were built without compromise: maximum power, maximum torque, maximum displacement, with fuel economy and emissions being afterthoughts. It's a philosophy that would soon disappear forever from American automotive design. From a performance standpoint, these engines were genuinely impressive. Even by today's standards, 400 horsepower and 450-plus pound-feet of torque from a naturally aspirated engine is respectable. In 1958, it was absolutely earth-shattering.
The 430 MEL could move a 5,000-pound Lincoln faster than most sports cars of the era. The rarity factor also makes these engines special. With limited production numbers and even fewer survivors, owning and experiencing a 430 MEL is a rare privilege. It's a chance to experience American automotive engineering from a time when excess was not only acceptable, but celebrated. Finally, the 430 MEL represents what American luxury cars were all about in their heyday. This wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. It said that American engineering could create something massive, powerful, and impressive that no foreign competitor could match. It embodied the confidence and optimism of America in the late 1950s. The Lincoln 430 MEL may be forgotten by most, but it deserves its place in the pantheon of great American V8 engines. This was an engine that pushed boundaries, set new standards for power and performance, and represented the absolute pinnacle of 1950s American automotive excess. While it may have been thirsty, expensive, and ultimately short-lived, the 430 MEL accomplished something remarkable. It created a genuine American super engine that could compete with anything in the world. In an era of increasing globalization and efficiency concerns, it's worth remembering a time when American engineers could create something this audacious and impressive. The next time someone mentions legendary Ford big blocks, don't let them forget about the 430 MEL. This forgotten luxury giant deserves to be remembered alongside the 427s, 428s, and 429s that get all the attention. It may be rare, it may be thirsty, and it may be expensive to maintain, but the Lincoln 430 MEL is undeniably one of the most impressive engines ever to roll out of Dearborn. What do you think about the 430 MEL? Have you ever experienced one of these rare engines? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's forgotten automotive gems.